In the heart of a cold, rain-soaked alley, Ranger, a once legendary canine betrayed and broken, had vowed never to care again. But when two terrified baby squirrels, Hazel and Willow, stumbled to his feet, starving and hunted, something deep within him awoke. They weren't just lost. They were running from a darkness far greater than anyone imagined. Now, with danger closing in and the past resurfacing, Ranger must make an impossible choice: turn his back like the world did to him, or risk everything to protect the innocent. The rain had not stopped for 3 days in Denver, and the old city looked as if it had been carved from iron and sorrow. Water streaked down cracked brick walls and pooled in the potholes of empty streets, the orange glow of broken street lamps trembling in every puddle. It was early March, when winter still clung to the city like a stubborn ghost, and the cold wind howled through the narrow alleys lined with shuttered storefronts and forgotten lives. The storm had driven most creatures indoors, but not all. In a dark alley behind what used to be a bakery, an old German shepherd named Ranger dragged his tired body into the shadow of a rusted fire escape. Ranger was no ordinary dog. Once, he had been a legend, a police K9 whose name was known in precincts across the state. At 10 years old, his black and tan coat was grizzled with silver, his once powerful frame now stiff from old injuries and the creeping weight of age. One ear was torn from a knife fight during a drug raid, and a pale scar ran along his left side, a permanent souvenir from the bullet that should have ended his career. But none of that had hurt him as deeply as betrayal. His handler, James Royce, a man Ranger had trusted with his life, had sold him out during an undercover operation 5 years earlier. Betrayed, abandoned, and left for dead, Ranger survived, but something inside him died that night. He no longer trusted humans. He no longer believed in heroes. And most painfully, he no longer believed in himself. Now, he scavenged through trash cans for scraps, relying on instinct and memory to keep himself alive. The alley he had claimed as home was narrow and damp, flanked by abandoned buildings and an overflowing dumpster. A flattened cardboard box tucked behind a stack of rusted crates served as his den. It wasn't much, but it kept him out of the worst of the rain. Ranger sighed as he curled up inside, his body aching from the cold. It had been a long day of searching for food, with little success. His ribs pressed faintly against his skin now, not from starvation, but from the slow erosion of a life that no longer had purpose. He had seen enough cruelty to know that the world was indifferent, and he had promised himself he would never again risk his life for anyone. Then he heard it. At first it was barely audible over the pounding rain, a high, trembling chirp, fragile and uncertain. His ears twitched. It came again, closer this time. Ranger's instincts, dulled though they were, sharpened instantly. He rose slowly, sniffing the air. Beneath the smell of wet asphalt and rotting garbage, there was something else. Fear. From the shadows at the far end of the alley, 2 small shapes emerged, stumbling clumsily through the rain. They were squirrels, very young, no more than 2 months old, soaked to the bone and trembling violently. One was a reddish-brown bundle of frantic energy, darting forward despite its exhaustion. The other, smaller and gray, hesitated at every step, looking around as if expecting danger to leap from the darkness. The bolder one was Hazel, with bright, intelligent eyes that still carried a spark of defiance despite the storm. Her tail, bushy even in the rain, bore a strange black triangle, and a string of tiny numbers burned into the fur near the base. The other, Willow, was timid and cautious, her slender frame shaking with cold. Her wide, dark eyes darted nervously around the alley, and every sudden noise made her flinch. They were siblings, that much was clear, and they were terrified. Ranger growled low as they approached his den. "Get lost," he barked gruffly, baring his teeth. He didn't need company. He didn't need trouble. Hazel froze, her small body tense. Willow whimpered softly, but neither of them ran. Instead, they inched closer, desperation stronger than fear. "I said get lost!" Ranger barked again, his voice echoing off the wet brick walls. The gray squirrel flinched and ducked behind her sister, but Hazel took another shaky step forward, her tiny paws slipping on the slick ground. That was when Ranger saw the mark. The black triangle. The numbers. A memory slammed into him like a thunderclap. A raid 5 years ago, a hidden lab beneath a warehouse, cages stacked floor to ceiling, each marked with that same symbol. Animals screaming in pain, chemicals burning his nose, and then Royce's cold voice telling the men, "Good work getting him here. He was sniffing too close." And the gunshot, the betrayal, the darkness. Ranger's breath caught. He stared at Hazel, and suddenly these weren't just two stray squirrels seeking shelter. They were escapees, survivors, from the same kind of nightmare he had tried to stop. Willow sneezed violently, the sound small and pitiful. Hazel pressed closer to her, wrapping her tiny body around her shivering sister. And something deep inside Ranger, something he thought had died with his career and his faith, stirred. He took a step back and sighed. "Fine," he muttered, "but just until the rain stops." The squirrels didn't hesitate. They scrambled toward the cardboard box, pressing their wet fur against Ranger's thick coat. Willow buried her face against his chest, while Hazel curled up near his belly, her tiny body still trembling but slowly relaxing. Ranger told himself it was only temporary. He told himself he didn't care. But as the warmth of their small bodies seeped into his own, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Purpose. Hours passed. The storm grew worse, wind rattling the metal fire escape above and sending icy water streaming down the alley. Ranger stayed awake, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Hazel whimpered in her sleep, and Willow's tail flicked nervously against his side. They were running from something, he was sure of it, and whatever it wasn't finished. When dawn finally broke, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The Foy alley was still and silent, but Ranger knew better than to relax. Danger had a way of creeping up when you least expected it. As he looked down at the two tiny creatures curled against him, he felt the old instincts he had spent years trying to bury start to return. The careful calculation, the silent vigilance, the readiness to protect. He didn't know where they had come from. He didn't know who had marked Hazel's tail or why, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. And whether he liked it or not, his past, the one he had spent so long running from, had just found its way back into his life in the form of two trembling squirrels. For the first time in 5 years, Ranger was no longer just surviving. He was watching. He was planning. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars and bitterness, the heart of a protector was beating once again. The storm had passed, but Denver's back streets never looked clean after the rain. Puddles reflected the pale morning sky. Broken glass glittered like frost, and steam rose from manholes, curling through the chill air. The city was waking, but here, in the forgotten industrial district, life moved slower, quieter, like even time had lost interest. Ranger sat at the mouth of his alley, muscles stiff, eyes scanning the wet street beyond. Hazel and Willow were still curled up in the box behind him, their tiny breaths soft against the cardboard. He didn't know why he hadn't sent them away yet. Maybe because, deep down, he knew they had nowhere else to go. He turned his head when Hazel stirred. The little squirrel yawned, stretching her small arms and blinking up at him with those curious brown eyes. "Is it morning?" she squeaked, her voice fragile but curious. Willow, still half asleep, lifted her head only to tuck it back against her sister. "It's cold," she murmured. Hazel puffed her chest, trying to look brave. "We've been colder." Her tone carried more courage than her size should have allowed, and Ranger almost smiled. Almost. "Stay quiet," he said instead. "It's not safe out here in daylight." Hazel's nose twitched. "Safe from what?" she asked. Ranger didn't answer. The less they knew, the better. But the truth was, he didn't know either. He only knew that mark on Hazel's tail wasn't something that disappeared. People, dangerous people, had died trying to hide those experiments. If these two had escaped, someone would come looking. By midday, the sky had turned from gray to the dull color of lead. Ranger ventured out briefly to scavenge near the corner store dumpsters. When he returned, the faint scent of tobacco and metal made his fur rise. He knew that smell: sweat, oil, and the tang of danger. Someone was here. A shadow moved near the alley's entrance, tall and thin. Then a voice, rough and soaked in mockery. "Well, well, look what the storm dragged in." Ranger's growl rumbled low. From around the corner stepped a mangy mutt, part pit bull, part something meaner, with a torn ear and a white scar that cut across his snout. His fur was patchy, his eyes a pale, predatory yellow. His name was Grit, one of Royce's informants. Ranger had crossed paths with him years ago, a street scavenger who sold secrets to whoever paid most. He wasn't brave, but he was loyal to whoever fed him, and that made him dangerous. "Didn't think you were still breathing, Ranger," Grit sneered, circling just outside the alley. "Boss Royce said if I ever saw you, I should remind you some debts don't stay buried." Ranger's tail stiffened. "You're working for him again?" His voice was calm, but edged like broken glass. Grit chuckled, revealing sharp, dirty teeth. "A guy's gotta eat. Royce feeds well. Besides, he's got a new operation now. Bigger than before. And you've got something he wants." Ranger didn't move, but his body tensed, ready to spring. "You mean them," he said, voice low. Behind him, Hazel peeked from the box, eyes wide. Grit's grin widened. "2 little lab rats. The boss said they slipped out last week. You wouldn't believe the money in those tiny bodies." Hazel gasped softly. Willow hid behind her sister. Ranger stepped forward, blocking their view. "They're not yours," he growled. Grit tilted his head mockingly. "Everything's someone's property, old-timer. You, me, them. That's just the way the world works. Hand them over, and maybe I won't mention I saw you." "I don't take orders from snakes," Ranger snapped. His hackles rose, and Grit's mocking grin faltered. He took a cautious step back, sizing the older dog up. Ranger may have been aging, but his posture still carried the silent command of a trained canine, every inch muscle, control, and warning. Grit licked his lips. "You're making a mistake. Royce doesn't forgive. You know that better than anyone." "Then tell him he can find me himself," Ranger said coldly. For a heartbeat, silence filled the air between them, thick as smoke. Then Grit's grin returned, colder this time. "Your funeral cop." He turned, padding toward the street, his voice echoing down the alley. "Enjoy your new pets while you can. He'll come for them soon." When he was gone, Ranger stayed still for several minutes, ears pricked, eyes locked on the empty street. Only when he was certain they were alone again did he turn back towards the box. Hazel stood at its edge, trembling but defiant. Willow clung to her tail. "Who was that?" Hazel asked. "Trouble," Ranger muttered. She swallowed. He said Royce. Who's that?" Ranger's eyes darkened. No one you need to know. Hazel stepped closer. But he knows about us, doesn't he? He'll come. Yes, Ranger said quietly. He will. Silence fell. Only the distant hum of traffic broke it. Hazel shivered, but not just from the cold. Finally, Willow spoke, her small voice barely audible. We didn't mean to bring danger. We just wanted to get away. Ranger looked down at her. Get away from what? Willow's gaze drifted towards the puddle at her feet, her reflection trembling on the surface. The lab, she whispered. The people in white coats, the cages, the lights that never went off. Her voice trembled as if each word hurt. They said we were part of something called Project Renewal. We didn't understand, just pain and noise. Until one night, they forgot to lock our door. Hazel continued the story, her tone sharper, more protective. We ran, through vents, across pipes, through the rain. We heard them yelling behind us. They said something about data loss and specimens missing. But we didn't stop. Her tail flicked nervously. Then we saw your alley. Ranger's heart ached in a way he hadn't felt for years. They were children, frightened, marked, hunted, and he understood that kind of fear too well. He'd felt it in that warehouse, bleeding while the man he trusted walked away. You did good, he said finally, his voice low but steady. You survived. Hazel blinked up at him. What will you do now? Ranger looked toward the fading light of the alley mouth. The clouds had begun to break, revealing a thin sliver of blue sky. Now, he said, we prepare. That night, Ranger didn't sleep. He sat at the alley's entrance again, listening to the city breathe. Sirens far away, a passing train, the shuffle of footsteps that didn't belong. His mind moved through plans automatically. Escape routes, hiding places, patterns of noise and silence. He didn't want this fight, but the fight had found him. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. Inside the box, the squirrels slept close together, their tiny bodies rising and falling in rhythm. Ranger turned his gaze toward them, his eyes softening. Maybe the world hadn't completely turned to stone after all. Maybe there was still something worth protecting, even for a broken old dog. Far across town, in the upper floor of a dimly lit warehouse, James Royce stood beside a cluttered desk littered with maps and computer screens. The man had changed little since the day he'd betrayed his partner. Mid-40s now, tall, lean, and sharply dressed, his once boyish face was hardened by greed and late nights. His hair, once sandy blonde, was going gray at the temples, and the thin scar along his jawline, a gift from Ranger years ago, gave him a permanent sneer. He tapped a cigarette against the desk as Grit stood nervously nearby. "You're sure it was him?" Royce asked, his voice smooth, cold, and dangerous. "Positive," Grit replied, his tail tucked low. "He's got the runts with him, the ones from the shipment." Royce exhaled smoke slowly, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Perfect. Then the old mutt just saved us the trouble of searching." He crushed the cigarette in the ashtray and leaned forward, his icy blue eyes glinting. "Bring me my property, Grit. Alive if possible. But if Ranger gets in the way—" He paused, smirking. "Put him down for good this time." The next evening, Denver's skyline glowed faintly through a blanket of fog. The city's hum was distant here, swallowed by the echo of dripping pipes and the occasional rumble of a passing freight train. Ranger stood at the edge of the alley, his fur slick with dew, his eyes focused on the flickering neon sign of a shuttered pawn shop across the street. Since Grit's visit, he hadn't slept. Every shadow seemed to breathe danger. Every whisper of wind felt like a warning. Hazel and Willow slept nearby, huddled inside an old crate lined with newspapers, their small chests rising and falling in tandem. He envied their brief moments of peace. A sound, soft, deliberate, rhythmic, caught Ranger's attention. Hooves, slow, measured, confident. He turned just as a tall black horse emerged from the fog, his mane glistening like ink under the streetlight. The horse carried himself with effortless grace, even on the cracked asphalt, his gait poised and elegant. "Still haunting alleys, are we, old friend?" the horse said, his voice deep and amused. Ranger narrowed his eyes. "Valentine," he muttered. "Didn't think the racetrack let their washed-up stars wander this far." Valentine smirked, flicking his tail. "They don't. But retirement gets boring, you know? The crowds cheer, the roses fade, and suddenly you're just a has-been with too much time and not enough applause." His tone was playful, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. "Word travels, Ranger. You've stirred up ghosts. Royce's men are sniffing around again." Ranger didn't reply. Valentine stepped closer, his polished black coat gleaming even under the dirty light. Up close, he was magnificent. Tall, powerful, with long legs built for speed and a neck that carried an air of nobility. But behind the charm was a survivor. His left flank bore a thin white scar, the mark of a whip from his racing days, when he'd been pushed past exhaustion for one last win. The scar had never healed properly, and neither had his pride. "They're looking for 2 escapees," Valentine continued. "Small, fast, and apparently valuable." His gaze flicked towards the crate. "Those 2, I assume?" Hazel peeked out from inside, blinking at the tall newcomer. "You're a horse," she said, her tone a mix of awe and suspicion. Valentine bowed his head slightly. "At your service, little lady. Name's Valentine. Retired, refined, and regrettably curious." Willow whispered to Hazel, "He talks too much." Valentine laughed softly. "Smart one, that gray one. You'd better keep her close, Ranger. Now down to business. I've got information, and you're going to want to hear it." Ranger tilted his head. "Talk." Valentine leaned in. "Royce is moving something big. A shipment. I overheard the handlers at the old rail yard near Blake Street. Cages, marked cargo, unregistered vehicles. 3 nights from now. He's consolidating everything and transferring it out of state." Hazel's ears perked. "That's where we came from. The trains. They use trains to move the others." Ranger's pulse quickened. "You're sure?" "As sure as a horse can be without opposable thumbs," Valentine said dryly. "Whatever's going down there, it's the heart of his operation. And if you're planning to stop it, you'll need help." "Help?" Ranger repeated. Valentine nodded. "You can't do this alone, Ranger. You may have been a K9, but you're not 20 anymore. Royce has muscle, guns, and eyes everywhere. You'll need allies who know the streets better than he does." Ranger's jaw tightened. "Allies get killed." Valentine's expression softened, just slightly. "So do heroes who work alone?" The words hung heavy between them. Ranger hated that Valentine was right. He'd lost enough comrades to know that bravery meant nothing without strategy. He looked toward Hazel and Willow, both watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. They weren't just survivors now. They were his responsibility. "Fine," he said finally. "Who do you have in mind?" Valentine's eyes gleamed. "Follow me." They traveled through the industrial sprawl, the fog thickening as night deepened. Ranger kept low to the ground, muscles tense, every sense alert. Valentine moved silently beside him, his hooves barely making a sound on the wet pavement. After several blocks, they reached an abandoned factory whose broken windows glowed faintly with candlelight. The door creaked as Valentine nudged it open. Inside, the air smelled of oil and rust. Tools, scraps of wire, and half-dismantled machines littered the floor. A pair of small hands worked quickly at the far end of the room, manipulating a lock with careful precision. The creature turned, a raccoon, his fur graying around the muzzle, his eyes bright and calculating. "Ranger, meet Clabber," Valentine announced. "Locksmith, engineer, occasional thief. Don't mind the mess. He calls it art." Clabber straightened up, brushing his paws on a rag. He was shorter than Ranger expected, with nimble fingers and a permanent smudge of grease across his cheek. His fur was coarse, and his tail flicked with restless energy. "I don't work for free," he said bluntly, voice gravelly from years of smoke and city dust. "And I don't work with dogs." Ranger stepped forward. "Good. I don't hire amateurs." For a second, silence. Then Clabber grinned, showing sharp teeth. "Fair enough, old man. Let's hear the job." Valentine explained quickly. The shipment, the rail yard, Royce's involvement. Clabber listened, his eyes narrowing, his mind clearly working faster than his paws could move. When Valentine finished, Clabber climbed onto a stack of crates and crossed his arms. "Breaking into a guarded freight yard? With who? You two and the Squirrels?" "4," came a voice from above. They all looked up. Perched on a rusted steel beam near the ceiling was a falcon, his feathers dark brown mottled with streaks of gold. One wing hung slightly lower than the other, an old injury, poorly healed, but his eyes were fierce, golden and alive with intelligence. "Thorn," Valentine said with a nod. "Scout, strategist, and the only set of eyes sharper than mine." Thorn spread his wings, though the damaged one trembled. "You'll need air support," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I can't fly long distances anymore, but I can track from above. I've seen those trucks. They move at dawn." Ranger studied the bird for a moment. "What happened to your wing?" Thorn's gaze hardened. "Royce's men. Years ago. I was caged like the others until I broke free." That was all he said, and it was enough. Ranger looked around at them. Valentine, proud and restless. Clabber, clever and reckless. Thorn, wounded but unbroken. Hazel and Willow, small but brave. An unlikely band, united by pain and purpose. He felt something stir deep within his chest again. The soldier's instinct, the leader's burden. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We have 3 days. We learn their routes, watch their guards, and find their weak points. No mistakes. We move fast, hit harder, and disappear." Valentine smiled. "There's the old commander." Clabber cracked his knuckles. "Guess I'll dust off the tools." Thorn lowered his head in quiet agreement. And Hazel, her little heart beating fast, looked up at Ranger with something like pride. "You're not alone anymore, Dad," she whispered softly, though only Willow heard her. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the mountains. The fog thickened again, wrapping Denver in silence. But in that abandoned factory, under the dim flicker of candlelight, a plan was forming. And for the first time in years, Ranger wasn't running from the past. He was heading straight toward it. The sun was sinking behind the jagged Denver skyline, casting the rail yard in shades of copper and ash. Rusted freight cars lined the tracks like sleeping giants, their steel bodies groaning with the weight of age. A cold wind swept through, carrying the smell of oil, rain, and something else. Fear. Ranger crouched behind a row of shipping crates, his eyes fixed on the far end of the yard where floodlights began to flicker to life. 3 days of planning had led to this moment, and everything depended on precision. Thorn circled above, a dark silhouette against the fading light. His injured wing limited his altitude, but his eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the field with soldierly focus. Over the small radio transmitter Clabber had rigged from scrap electronics, Thorn's voice crackled softly. "Guards on the east fence, 3 men, rifles slung, 2 trucks idle near the main platform. I count at least a dozen cages." Ranger's ears twitched. "Copy that. Keep eyes open." He glanced at the others crouched beside him in the shadows. Valentine stood tall even in the gloom, his black coat gleaming faintly, the muscles in his legs tense and ready. Clabber, smaller and wiry, adjusted the straps on a bag filled with tools, his nimble paws already twitching with anticipation. Hazel and Willow huddled close to Ranger's side, their tiny bodies trembling, not from fear, but from the cold determination of knowing this was the place they had escaped from. "All right," Ranger murmured. "We stick to the plan. Thorn gives the signal. Valentine distracts the guards. Clabber breaks the locks. I'll handle the cages. No mistakes." Valentine snorted softly. "You make it sound easy, old man." Ranger's expression didn't change. It never is. The first part went smoothly. At Thorn's signal, the Falcon swooped low, striking one of the truck's mirrors with his talons, sending it shattering to the ground. The startled guards shouted, guns raised, scanning the dark sky. That was Valentine's cue. He surged forward from the shadows like a storm, hooves pounding the gravel, letting out a fierce, echoing neigh. Floodlights swung wildly as men cursed, chasing the horse as he weaved between the trucks with effortless grace. Clabber darted toward the loading platform, his bag slung over one shoulder. He moved like smoke, silent and sure, his nimble fingers picking through the first padlock. Within seconds, there was a click, and the lock fell open. "One down," he whispered. He worked the next one, faster this time, the rhythm of metal against metal echoing softly. Behind him, Ranger appeared, his large frame silent despite his size. Together they began freeing the animals, rabbits, raccoons, birds, all thin, scarred, their eyes wide with confusion and hope. Hazel and Willow scurried between cages, whispering encouragement in their small voices. Then came the sound Ranger dreaded, the low growl of an engine that didn't belong. Headlights flared from the far gate, and the truck that rolled in was black, clean, and new, nothing like the rusted relics around it. From its cab stepped a man Ranger hadn't seen in 5 years. James Royce. He looked older, but not weaker. His once sandy blonde hair was now streaked with gray, his lean face carved by time and sin. He wore a dark leather jacket over a crisp shirt, the kind of man who thought danger was an accessory. In his right hand, a silver cigarette glimmered faintly beneath the floodlights, and his blue eyes, cold, calculating, found Ranger in an instant. "Well, if it isn't my old partner," Royce said, his voice smooth as glass but sharp as a blade. "Still playing the hero, I see." Ranger stiffened, his growl low and steady. "You shouldn't have come here." "Oh, but I should have," Royce replied, lighting his cigarette. The small flame reflected in his eyes. "You cost me a fortune when you disappeared, and now you've cost me again." His gaze drifted toward Hazel and Willow, who froze beside an overturned crate. A slow smile crept across his face. "So these are the little miracles everyone's been talking about." Before Ranger could move, Royce whistled, a sharp, high-pitched sound that made every nerve in Ranger's body seize. It was the same frequency they had used in training, designed to trigger compliance in K9 units. For a heartbeat, Ranger's body obeyed out of old instinct, muscles locking in place. But then the memory of betrayal cut through the fog. The shot, the pain, the sight of Royce walking away as he bled on the cold floor. The leash of control snapped. "Not anymore," Ranger snarled, lunging forward. Royce stepped back quickly, tossing the cigarette aside. "Still got some bite left in you, huh?" He nodded toward the truck, and 2 of his men emerged from the shadows, both carrying rifles. One was tall and lanky, with a nervous twitch in his jaw. The other, broader, his nose crooked from too many fights. The taller one grabbed Hazel by the tail before she could react, yanking her up roughly. Willow tried to bite his boot, but the man laughed, swinging her away. "Careful," Royce warned. "They're worth more alive." "Let them go," Ranger barked, his voice echoing through the yard. Royce smirked. "How about a trade? You come with me quietly, and maybe I don't burn this place to the ground." "You're bluffing." Royce pulled a small remote from his jacket pocket. "You should know me better than that." He pressed a button, and from the nearby truck, flames erupted, orange tongues licking through stacks of crates and spilled fuel. The fire spread fast, racing toward the cages. Ranger's mind spun. The animals were panicking, their cries piercing through the crackle of flames. Valentine reappeared from the far side of the yard, his flank bleeding from a graze, eyes wild with alarm. "Ranger!" he shouted. "We're out of time!" Royce climbed into his truck, dragging Hazel and Willow with him. "You can save them," he called over the roar of the growing inferno. "Or you can save yourself. But you can't do both." And then he was gone, tires screeching, smoke and sparks rising in his wake. For one split second, Ranger froze between two worlds, the past and the present, vengeance and duty. Then he turned toward the flames. "Clabber, get the locks open," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The raccoon was already at work, teeth gritted, paws moving faster than thought. "Thorn, clear the roof!" Ranger barked again. The falcon dove through the smoke, striking at hinges, creating escape routes where there were none. Valentine charged into the fire, kicking down metal barriers with powerful hooves. Together they carved paths through the heat. Ranger grabbed one cage in his jaws and pulled it free, ignoring the searing pain as the metal scorched his skin. The animals inside scattered, some limping, some crawling, but alive. Again and again, he went back into the blaze, dragging cages, herding the terrified creatures towards the open yard. "Ranger, stop! The tank's gonna blow!" Clabber screamed, but Ranger didn't listen. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, yet he pressed on. In the deepest corner of the inferno, he found a crate half buried under debris. Inside, a small fox pup lay unconscious. Ranger bit through the lock and dragged it out just as a thunderous explosion ripped through the yard. The blast threw him to the ground, his ears ringing, his body racked with pain. Flames danced in the sky, painting the night red. Through the haze, he saw the freed animals huddled together, Valentine limping but standing guard, Clabber coughing in the smoke, Thorn circling above. The operation was in ruins, but they had saved lives. Ranger staggered to his feet, every muscle screaming, the fire reflected in his eyes like molten gold. Royce had escaped, but the fight was far from over. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Ranger turned toward the dark road where the truck had vanished. He would find them. He would bring Hazel and Willow home, no matter what it took. The smell of smoke still clung to the Denver air as the night bled into dawn. The fire at the rail yard had burned deep into the early hours, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson and gray. Somewhere along the outskirts of the city, the black truck carrying Hazel and Willow thundered down an old highway, its tires kicking up gravel and ash. Inside, the two squirrels huddled together in a small steel cage, trembling from exhaustion and fear. Hazel's fur was streaked with soot, one paw pressed against Willow's shoulder as if she could shield her sister from the world. Royce sat in the driver's seat, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the pistol holstered against his thigh. His jaw was clenched tight, the veins in his neck visible beneath the dim glow of the dashboard. The man looked worn, yet menacing, the kind of predator who had survived too long by outsmarting his prey. In the passenger seat beside him sat his lieutenant, Vince Kellen, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with a military haircut and an old scar running across his lip. Vince had the calm cruelty of someone who'd followed orders his whole life, first in combat, then in crime. "They'll come for them," Vince said, lighting a cigarette, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "You saw what that mutt did at the yard. He's not normal." Royce smirked without looking over. "He was trained to be the best. I made him that way, and that means I know how to break him again." He took a drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing like an ember of old hatred. "By the time he finds us, these two will already be back in the lab, and our investors will be very, very happy." Behind them, the world was already stirring. On the far side of Denver, in the gray stillness after the fire, Thorn rose into the air once more. His wings ached with every movement, the damaged one trembling under the weight of the cold wind, but his spirit burned hotter than the flames they'd just escaped. Below him, the city sprawled, streets glistening from fire hoses, police sirens fading, and chaos slowly giving way to order. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, searching the horizon. "Where are you?" His keen eyes caught a flicker of movement on the old freight road leading north. A black truck, fast and deliberate, weaving through the early traffic. There. He folded his wings and dove, skimming the treetops, determination pushing him through the pain. At the same time, miles away, a small farmhouse sat hidden behind the foothills. Its wooden fence was old but sturdy, and a hand-painted sign read, "Happy Tales Animal Sanctuary." Inside, Jack Henderson, a retired firefighter in his early 60s, sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the morning newspaper. His hair, once jet black, was now more silver than gray, his face marked with the lines of a man who had seen both tragedy and triumph. His wife, Maria, stood by the sink, her auburn hair tied back, her calm presence filling the room with quiet strength. She had once been a veterinary nurse before they opened the sanctuary together, a woman whose compassion often outshone her caution. Jack set down his coffee. "You hear that?" Maria looked up. "What?" Before either could speak again, a sharp tapping came against the window, then another, and then, through the glass, they saw the falcon. Thorn landed awkwardly on the porch railing, feathers singed, chest heaving from the flight. Maria rushed to open the door. "Good heavens," she gasped, seeing the bird's wounds. "You poor thing." Thorn flapped once, cutting her off. "No time," he rasped. His voice startled her, not because he spoke, but because of the urgency in it. "Fire. Animals in danger. Need help. Follow." Jack stared in disbelief, but Maria didn't hesitate. Years of working with rescues had taught her to trust instinct over logic. She grabbed her emergency kit, tossing Jack the truck keys. "Let's move." Within minutes, they were speeding toward the city, Thorn gliding low ahead of them, leading the way. Back in Denver, the scene at Biotech Solutions was spiraling out of control. Valentine had arrived there hours earlier, charging through the facility gates like a living thunderbolt. The retired racehorse's black mane flew as he tore down fences, smashed cameras, and kicked over storage crates. Security alarms blared, lights flashed, and the chaos drew exactly the attention he wanted. News vans pulled up along the road, reporters shouting questions as cameras rolled. "This is Biotech Solutions testing compound," one journalist said breathlessly, facing the lens. "We're witnessing what appears to be a violent disturbance, possibly linked to the illegal animal experiments rumored for months." Inside the burning structure, guards scrambled to contain the pandemonium. Valentine's deep voice echoed through the corridors. "Come out, cowards! Show the world what you've been hiding!" He kicked open a door, revealing rows of cages, sterile labs, and frightened animals whimpering in the dim light. His fury was righteous, but it was also precise. He didn't just destroy, he exposed. Every smashed door revealed another secret Royce's empire had buried, and outside, the world was watching. By the time police arrived, the facility was surrounded by flashing lights and news crews. A flood of rescued animals was being carried out by volunteers. In the distance, the roar of Jack's truck drew closer. Maria jumped out before it even stopped, sprinting toward the chaos with her bag of medical supplies. "Where's the injured?" she called out. "Over here," a paramedic shouted. "There's an old German shepherd, burned, but still breathing." Maria froze, her eyes softening with horror and awe as she knelt beside Ranger. His fur was blackened in patches, his breathing shallow but steady. "Oh, you brave soul," she whispered. "You've done enough. Let us help now." She covered him with a clean blanket, her hands steady even as her heart raced. Jack crouched beside her. "He's the one from the alley fires last year, isn't he? The one they called Ghost Dog?" "Maybe," Maria murmured, her focus never leaving Ranger's side. "But tonight, he's coming home with us." As they lifted him carefully into their truck, Thorne landed on the roof, his eyes locked on the road to the north. "Royce has them," he said hoarsely. "Hazel and Willow, heading toward the old rail junction." Jack looked at the Falcon as if seeing a miracle unfold. "Then let's finish what this dog started." He turned to Maria. "You drive him back to the sanctuary. I'll follow the bird." Maria hesitated, but one look at Ranger's motionless form made her nod. "Be careful, Jack." Meanwhile, on that same highway, Royce's luck was finally turning. The faint wail of sirens echoed behind them, growing louder. Vince's cigarette trembled between his fingers. "We've got company," Royce cursed, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. "How the hell?" A flash of movement above made him glance upward. Thorne dove out of the dawn light, striking the windshield with a screech that sent the truck veering. Vince shouted, trying to grab the wheel, but it was too late. The vehicle careened off the road, crashing into a ditch with a violent roll. The metal cage with Hazel and Willow was thrown free, tumbling across the dirt. The two squirrels scrambled out through the bent bars just as the truck door burst open. Royce stumbled out, dazed but alive. He barely had time to raise his gun before floodlights flooded the field. Police cruisers surrounded him, sirens cutting through the morning air. "James Royce!" a voice shouted through a megaphone. "You're under arrest!" Royce's hand shook, but his arrogance refused to die. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You can't stop what's already built." Then Jack Henderson appeared from behind a squad car, his firefighter's stance firm, his expression calm, but unyielding. "Maybe not," he said, "but we can stop you." Moments later, Royce was tackled to the ground, cuffed, and dragged away as cameras flashed from the road above. Hazel and Willow watched from a nearby bush, trembling but safe. Thorne landed beside them, folding his wings gently over their small bodies. "It's over," he whispered. For the first time in days, the two little squirrels allowed themselves to believe it. The morning sun rose over the Colorado foothills, gilding the valley in soft gold. Dew clung to the wooden fences and wildflowers that framed the Happy Tales sanctuary, painting the place in the quiet light of redemption. It had been 3 weeks since the fire, since the arrest, since the world finally saw what cruelty had hidden in plain sight. For the first time in years, Ranger woke to the sound of birds instead of sirens. He lay on a thick wool blanket in the corner of the main barn, bandages still wrapping his left flank and shoulder. The smell of hay, fresh paint, and warm sunlight filled the air. Outside, laughter echoed, Maria Henderson's voice mingling with the chatter of children who visited on weekends to feed the rescued animals. The place pulsed with life again. Hazel and Willow were never far from him. They had built a small nest from scraps of wool and straw beside his resting spot, and every morning they brought him offerings, acorns, bits of bread, or sometimes just a smile. Hazel remained the bold one, her reddish fur always slightly tousled, her curious eyes bright as ever. Willow, quieter and gentler, spent hours perched on Ranger's paw, whispering little stories about the other animals in the sanctuary. "Come on, big guy," Hazel chirped one morning, patting his leg with both paws. "You're not going to lie there forever, are you? The horses are starting to gossip." Ranger opened one eye, his voice a rumbling growl softened by affection. "Horses gossip?" "They do now," Hazel replied proudly. "Valentine taught them." At the mention of the name, a familiar whinny sounded from outside. Ranger pushed himself upright, wincing but steady. Valentine stood beyond the paddock fence, sunlight glinting off his black coat. The once broken racing horse looked stronger now, his posture confident, his eyes filled with mischief and purpose. "Morning, soldier," Valentine called. "Good to see you vertical again." Ranger limped closer, his tail swishing slowly. "I was starting to enjoy the quiet. Guess that's over now." Valentine chuckled, the sound deep and warm. "Quiet's for the retired, and you, my friend, are far from that." Nearby, Clabber was perched on a toolbox, tinkering with a broken gate latch. His fur was streaked with oil again, his paws moving in practiced rhythm. The raccoon had taken to fixing everything in sight: barn doors, feeders, even the sanctuary's old radio. "This place was built by amateurs," he muttered, tightening a screw with his claws. "But it's got heart. Guess that counts for something." "You grumble too much," Maria called as she passed by, carrying a bucket of apples. She wore her usual work clothes: worn jeans, flannel shirt, hair tied up in a red scarf. Her eyes were gentle but firm, the kind that made even stubborn animals obey. "When you're done complaining, I need the chicken pen latch fixed. Again." Clabber raised a paw in mock salute. "Yes, ma'am." Maria smiled, shaking her head as she walked toward the barn. Ranger watched her for a moment. She was kind, but strong in a quiet way that reminded him of people he used to serve with, those who kept going when others fell apart. She treated him not like a hero or a broken soldier, but like family. Above, the shadow of wings swept over the pasture. Thorn soared in wide circles, his feathers catching the morning light. His injured wing had healed enough for short flights, though the scar across it still glimmered pale against the brown and gold. He called down, voice clear and steady. "All quiet north of the ridge. No movement." Valentine nodded approvingly. "The sky's yours again, my friend." Thorn landed gracefully on the fence post, folding his wings. "Feels good to be useful," he said. His golden eyes drifted to Ranger. "How's the leg?" "Stiff," Ranger admitted, "but it'll hold." Hazel scampered up onto his shoulder, grinning. "That's because I've been supervising your recovery." Willow added softly, "We're proud of you, Dad." The word hit Ranger like sunlight breaking through clouds. Dad. It had been years since anyone called him anything but dog or mutt. His ears twitched, his heart tight in his chest. Hazel nuzzled his cheek while Willow wrapped her tail around his neck. For a long time, Ranger didn't speak. Then, with a low rumble of warmth, he said, "You two are trouble." That afternoon, the sanctuary was busier than usual. News of the biotech scandal had spread, and donations poured in. Volunteers arrived to help rebuild, and journalists occasionally dropped by to film updates. Among the visitors was a young reporter named Megan Carter, a woman in her late 20s with sharp eyes and an unshakable voice. She had short blonde hair cut to her jawline, freckles across her nose, and the no-nonsense air of someone who'd seen both good and bad in the world. Maria greeted her at the gate. "You're from Channel 9? Megan nodded, adjusting her camera bag. We're doing a follow-up on the rescue effort. People want to know what happened to the animals, and the heroes who saved them." Maria glanced toward Ranger, who stood beneath an old oak tree, Hazel and Willow perched nearby. "You can film," she said quietly, "but don't call him a hero. He's just trying to heal." The segment aired that evening, showing images of the sanctuary's peaceful life. The animals grazing, the volunteers smiling, the camera lingering on Ranger as the narrator said, "Sometimes the bravest hearts are the ones that have already been broken." The broadcast reached millions, and overnight, Happy Tales became a symbol of hope. But for Ranger, fame meant little. What mattered was the rhythm of ordinary days, the steady beat of hoofsteps, the flutter of wings, the laughter of small voices. He found peace in the simple acts, helping Clabber drag lumber, for new kennels, standing guard at the fence line, letting Willow nap between his paws, while Hazel told exaggerated stories about their adventures. One evening, as twilight fell over the sanctuary, Ranger walked to the top of the hill overlooking the property. The air was cool, scented with pine and hay. Behind him, the barn lights glowed softly, and the sounds of his new family drifted upward. Clabber humming as he worked, Valentine telling tales to the younger foals, Thorn calling out from his perch, Hazel giggling at something Willow whispered. Maria approached quietly, her boots crunching on the gravel. She stopped beside him, folding her arms. "You've built quite a little army here," she said, smiling. Ranger looked out over the valley. "Not an army," he said softly. "A family." Maria nodded, her eyes glistening. "You deserve it, you know." Ranger didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the first stars blinked awake. He thought of all the years he had spent running from ghosts, the weight of betrayal that had nearly broken him. And now, standing here surrounded by those he'd saved and those who had saved him, the past finally loosened its grip. A cool breeze swept through the grass, carrying the scent of new beginnings. Hazel and Willow came bounding up the hill, giggling, and pressed themselves against his legs. Ranger lowered his head, resting his muzzle gently between them. For the first time in many years, he smiled. Not out of duty, not out of relief, but from the simple, profound truth that he was home. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or shining light. They come quietly, in the form of a loyal dog, 2 brave little squirrels, and the courage to love again. What happened at Happy Tales wasn't just a rescue story. It was a reminder that even in a broken world, God still works through kindness, through second chances, and through hearts willing to heal. Maybe you've walked through your own kind of fire, loss, betrayal, loneliness, but remember this: no matter how dark it gets, God never stops writing your story. He brings people, or sometimes animals, into your life to remind you that love still wins, faith still heals, and miracles are still real. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and let's keep spreading light together. And tonight, as you close your eyes, take a moment to thank the Lord for every rescued soul, every act of grace, and for the quiet miracles that walk beside us every day. May God bless you and everyone you love.